In United States history, suffrage has always been a deterrent for the Black community. Until 1870, only white men were allowed to vote. It was not until the country entered a state of Reconstruction after the Civil War that the 15th Amendment was passed, extending the right to all male citizens, including former slaves who had just gained citizenship through the 14th Amendment passed in 1868. But this was not enough to ensure suffrage for all Americans. In the South, intimidation tactics such as white nationalist groups like the KKK and practices including lynchings were used to keep black men away from the ballot. In the 1890s, to further deter voters, many southern states passed discriminatory poll practices such as poll tax, literacy tests, and an act known as the Grandfather Clause, stating that anyone whose grandfather was able to vote prior to January 1st, 1867 would also have that right. As Jim Crow laws began to gain traction, black people had little political power to fight them. In 1955, a 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till was brutally beaten and killed by Roy Bryant and J.W. Malone for allegedly flirting with Bryant's wife. Being faced with an all-white jury, all having the requirement of being registered voters, these men were acquitted for their crime. This tragedy was a catalyst for the civil rights movement, with the main objectives of ending Jim Crow laws and ensuring minority suffrage without hindrance. Black communities protested throughout the nation with speeches, marches, and boycotts. Through debates within the voting rights campaign, the Selma demonstrations became the turning point of the Black suffrage movement by gaining national sympathies, negotiating federal action, and inspiring present-day campaigns for voting rights. February 1963, Bernard Lafayette of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in cooperation with Dallas County Voters League, launched a project in Selma to encourage more Black registration. This proved to be a difficult task as white hostilities and minority apprehensions grew. There were many failed attempts to use the strength in numbers to encourage more Black registration, and demonstrations held all over Selma were often put down with mass arrests. All the while, activists associated with the movement were being harassed by citizens and local law enforcement led by segregationist Sheriff Jim Clark. Even in 1964, with the passing of the Civil Rights Act submitted to Congress by JFK in 1963, the campaign in Selma were obstructed by state officials. In January 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference arrived in Selma. Though they were coming in support of the campaign, the pre-existing tensions between SNCC and SCLC caused internal debates for how to continue the campaign. Leaders of SNCC deeply resented leaders of SCLC for using the platform that they had built through enduring hardships, brutality, and jail for a large-scale mobilization that they disagreed with. They also resented the fact that SCLC and King quickly received more publicity in areas where SNCC dangerously campaigned. SCLC also believed that the only way to protect Black voting rights would be to get legislation passed on a national level, which SNCC viewed as futile as it would not be enforced. Despite the conflict, the campaign continued with SNCC's community building and SCLC reaching out for federal action. Through speeches and demonstration, King encouraged citizens in Selma to continue their fight while he reached out to President Lyndon B. Johnson to call his attention to the crisis in Selma and negotiated with him to take action. In a phone call between the two men, LBJ gave MLK advice for how to conduct the movement in Selma in order for him to take action.
If you can find the worst condition that you run into in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana, or South Carolina, where being denied the right to cast a vote. And if you just take that one illustration and get it on radio and get it on television and get it on in the pulpits, get it in the meetings, get it every place you can, pretty soon the fellow that didn't do anything but drive a tractor, he'll say, well, that's not right, that's not fair. And then that will help us on what we're going to shove through in the end.
On February 18th, at a demonstration, Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old Black man, was shot by a posse man and died 8 days later from the wound. His tragic death was a huge agitator for the heated activists. Soon after his death, leaders James Bevel of SCLC called for a march from Selma to Montgomery to gain the attention of legislators and citizens. So, on March 7, 1965, marching from Brown Chapel and led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams, protesters marched to Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they were met with a barricade of state troopers. The troopers gave the protesters orders to turn back and leave, but they stood strong. Thus, chaos ensued. With bullwhips, billy clubs, and tear gas, troopers violently handled the protesters. Many knocked unconscious and dozens wounded, the march was forced back to the church. This catastrophe, quickly dubbed Bloody Sunday, was quickly broadcasted and on display for all Americans to see. Horrified by the mistreatment inflicted by state troopers, the protests began to gain sympathy from all groups around the nation, leading to Bloody Sunday becoming a turning point of the movement. People from all over the country, as many as 2,000, came together in Selma to help the cause. After these events, President Lyndon B. Johnson enters the pictures and begins to openly sympathize with protests in Selma. He begins to negotiate a Voting Rights Act to Congress.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
On March 20th, 1965, after Judge Frank Johnson approved the Third March to Montgomery, LBJ issued an executive order authorizing federal use of the Alabama National Guard as protection for the marchers. The march began on March 21st and reached Montgomery on March 25th. The protests, eventually growing into a crowd of as many as 25,000, marched day and night in sunshine and rain 54 miles all the way to Montgomery. Holding signs, singing hymns, and chanting, the spectacle of a diverse group of people linking arms and marching for the similar cause of the protection of a democratic process truly reflected the climax of the diplomatic efforts of Selma civil rights leaders since 1963. Five months after the conclusion of the march, on August 6, 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law, officially placing regulations on straight restrictions on voting. In the short term, the act ensured tremendous success for the Black community, reigning about 50 years after its passing. By the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters were registered, and by 1972, Barbara Jordan of Texas and Andrew Young of Georgia were the first African Americans elected to Congress from the South since Reconstruction. In 1990, in Georgia, Black elected officials grew to 395, a far cry from the three prior to the act. As the terms of the act continued to be reinforced by United States presidents, Black voters continued to have success in state and national elections. So, with all the beneficial outcomes of the act, why now, in 2022, is there a struggle for voting rights? In 2013, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was annulled, the process of federal review being ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States. This allowed for, in recent years, about 400 restrictions being passed. Many of these disproportionately affect Black and Latino voters. In 2021 alone, more than 30 restrictions were passed in at least 19 states. In partnership with the family of Martin Luther King Jr., the Deliver for Voting Rights campaign urges vast number of citizens to participate in order for the objective of the protest to reach the United States legislators. Their efforts directly mirror those of civil rights leaders in Selma in 1965. The Deliver for Voting Rights campaign advocates for the passing of strengthening voting rights acts, such as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. The campaign in Selma continues to greatly influence their campaign. With similar speeches and marches, activists continue to be the voice of the movement and stress the importance of the act to the democratic process of voting. And until the acts are passed, they will continue to negotiate for the ballot.